This is our Locknote session to cap the Black Hat Asia conference. We like to kind of wind it down a little bit with a more social panel where we discover what's on the minds of our speakers and review board members. And this is all part of the overall conference, which we want to thank all of our sponsors for making possible. And one of our diamond sponsors, IBM, has helped contribute a lot to making Black Hat Asia possible. And so before we start our panel, I want to introduce Ite Mayor, representing IBM Security. And like our first keynote introducer, he also went through RSA. It seems like sooner or later you end up working at RSA or EMC. He's now at IBM, where he leads 3 business lines: security, fighting fraud, and research. And he's also a security evangelist and donates a lot of his time to academic classes, volunteering for educational security awareness programs. So he believes in putting back into the community in his spare time and not just, commercial activity. So that's something we really respect. So I'd like to introduce Ite to give us some thoughts, and then we'll start off with our Locknote panel. So thank you for being here. Ite? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the session, the Locknote session. Hope everybody here enjoyed Black Hat this year. I think there were some very interesting talks. 3 specific topics that I enjoy hearing about, and there were several talks about. One was anything in the mobile space. We're hearing more and more about exploits and vulnerabilities in the mobile space, which is always interesting. The second, that there were some very interesting talks this year about is anything that has to do with critical infrastructure. So there were several talks this year about things from exploits from the sensor to the PLC to the command and control unit, which is also very interesting. And we keep getting more and more talks, which are great, in the topic of Internet of Things. Drones, cars, you name it, seems like everything can be hacked. And I personally really enjoy listening to these topics because I think we are at the point where we're still the point where people at home, end users, consumers, don't feel the pain of security. They feel an inconvenience. If you get your credit card stolen or your bank account hacked, it's an inconvenience. It's not a pain. But when we'll have the Internet of Things pretty much dominating our life, we will start feeling the pain of security. When you have ransomware on your car, in your house, or whatever, wherever it goes, people will start, I hope, will start demanding cybersecurity ratings from their vendors. So you just like today, you go and you buy a car and you demand a 5-star crash rating. I really hope to see people go up to car vendors and ask for a 5-star cybersecurity rating because there are 40 computers in the car. And unfortunately, right now, with Internet of Things, looks like a lot of the design is mostly get to the market first and let's have good features rather than have great security. And I think one of the key things to overcome this is information sharing. There should be a lot more information sharing. We're not doing enough as a security industry and in other industries as well. We should share what we know. Now, I've been on the other end. I've managed a security research lab, and I held all the information to myself. I didn't want to share it because I was competing. We have to change that game. We have to share what we know, and I really encourage you next time that you're in a field where you see all the vendors and you can talk to them, challenge them and ask them, what are you doing to share information? How are you contributing so that we're all safe? If you think about it like a medical crisis, when the Ebola crisis happened, doctors did not fight each other on the information they were collecting. Okay, they were sharing this information. The pharmaceuticals later battled it out who had the best solution. But when it comes down to the threat, we should share all that data. And I hope to see more of this in the near future. So from IBM Security and from all of the sponsors for this great event, I thank you for coming today, and I hope you enjoyed this session.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to start the main event. And everybody put your phones on mute. And we're going to do we're going to start we're going to end where we started with Dino, who was our keynote, and he introduced, I would say, sort of an overall sort of paradigm to think about different strategies for mitigating or reducing the effectiveness or the cost benefit of attackers. And one of the questions we're going to talk about is how effective do we think some of those strategies are? So some are probably really realistic, some are probably more aspirational, and so I know you two have some thoughts on that, having seen the talk. What did you respond well to, and what do you think needs to still be explored?
So, in general, I kind of agree with the idea of, engineering in these different things like compartmentalization and diversity if you can.
Just part of the SDLC.
Just part of the way you design and build software. But, I think some of the things are going to be really hard to do because there's economic reasons to not do them. And so one that stands out for me is the whole diversity. Dino talked about like the Android ecosystem doesn't have malware because of the diversity of all the firmwares and all the different hardware platforms. But if you look at the way we're building software now, a lot of it is made up of open source components, and we're assembling a lot of components together. So that is for economic reasons. You want to just reuse components, but it goes against diversity, right? Because everyone who is using OpenSSL was vulnerable to Heartbleed. And so I think if you're using common components and it's not a issue of memory corruption where the parameters really matter of the address layout and things like that, like a command injection vulnerability. I went to the talk on analyzing firmwares for web interfaces, and it was really interesting that they found the gentleman who did it found like Netgear routers, like 12 of them with the same command injection vulnerability, and I have to think they reused code. So I think code reuse is an efficiency, but as an efficiency goes against diversity, and I don't know how to kind of counter that one.
But besides that one, then, do you think if that one's more aspirational, or you only implement diversity within a system, so every time it boots, it sort of creates a unique situation for itself on install? Sort of like the way people are talking.
Yeah, the problem is with things like command injection, it's like it's because the parser was,
and so it doesn't matter where it's.
You put a semicolon in and you got command injection,
Right.
So it's tough.
Yeah, and I think the other point Dino made was about protecting attack surface with more attack surface. And I think, so there is this trend going on, especially from like tech companies that keep bashing on vendors for the right reasons. Like a lot of vendors do provide suboptimal solutions, but the problem is only actual tech companies have the resources to do in-house security there. It's better.
So this is like Tavis at Google pointing out all the problems.
Right, because Google is willing to pay for Tavis' salary to FUD stuff.
Right.
And so my point is that I agree with the problem. Like the solution cannot be, let's throw more C++ parser for PE files. But at the same time, like the solution should be, having some kind of rating or insurance for the vendors.
So
in order to, because otherwise, like you cannot there are a ton of companies that use tech but are not tech companies, and you cannot expect them to have the same degree of internal expertise of engineers.
But do you think, looking at the big picture, do you think that all of these attack surface with attack surface, it's a symptom of the problem of we as consumers or companies, we don't write the Microsoft operating system or Google or whatever. So our options to protect ourselves are really limited. So the only thing we can do is try to cover it up. And we know it's a suboptimal solution, but we can't go in and change Android. So it's the only rational thing we can do, even though we know it leads to more problems.
I mean, I think to a great extent, the problem is there is no incentive at the source.
Right.
To write code that is secure.
Yeah, I mean, look at cars, right? Like if a car wasn't made safe, what would you add to your car to make it safe? Would you put, cushions on your bumper?
Yeah, you put in a roll cage.
Yeah, but it's just not practical.
Right.
Yeah. Right. With software, it's practical to keep layering on more stuff. Right.
At one point, some safety technology like seatbelts were, I believe, aftermarket.
Yeah, they were.
And then became required for them to be integrated.
I mean, somebody said that to me a while ago that there is curve that most technology follows, and only when the curve seems pretty linear, then security comes in the picture as an important factor. But the concern here is that by the nature of IT and coding in general, that curve will never be linear, or it's also a case of like, be careful what you wish for, right? Because if it becomes linear, it means there isn't enough
A lot of innovation.
I want to respond to a couple of points that you made. So I didn't say that Android was without malware, but the malware is at the API level. So it is because malware authors need something stable because of the diversity and need a stable platform for their malware to be able to scale. Same way that application developers need something stable for their application to scale and have customers. But attacks below that use memory corruption and so on, the Android diversity provides an impediment towards especially scalable attacks. And one kind of thing we think about is there haven't been many bug classes that we've eliminated overtly, but a mechanism like this, in effect, may eliminate a lot of the memory corruption bug classes on the mobile ecosystem.
Right. So it's good for certain bug classes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean, it will shift the incentives, right? You will target somebody. You will not create any worms or must.
And so that that goes to my question about. I really had the question written down right here. On what we have solved, what bug classes have we eliminated? If you look at our historical performance as security community, where are our big victories and what are our big challenges? And I think we generally haven't had large victories against bug classes. We've mitigated them, sort of like cancer. We've mitigated them, but we haven't cured it. And I think that's probably because we're innovating really quickly or moving forward with new technologies. And so I just would like to get your opinion on that. Do you ever foresee a day where we actually do eliminate bug classes, or is the mode we just need to accept that we're going to always innovate away from our problems and we just leave this sort of trail of half solutions? And is that sustainable?
Yep.
Well, I was going to say that one of the problems with that is we're starting to put IT, and software into devices that last a really long time.
Long tail problem.
Right. So it's we might have moved on to something else, but we have an industrial control system that's 25 years old, or your smart TV might last 15 years now. So, we might have eliminated it in the new stuff, but if we're not updating all the old stuff, stuff sticks around.
Well, maybe that's also the imprecise question of focusing on bug classes versus larger problems. For instance, network worms. Those haven't happened since 2008.
Right.
Because of a number of things like network firewalls, improvements in code quality, and so even potentially wormable vulnerabilities just don't end up becoming worms.
So that's more of an attack class going away than a vulnerability class.
Yeah, I mean, the big problem with vulnerability classes going away is that it's really a function of the languages you use. And so by necessity, the cycle is much longer. So it's not that we don't know how to avoid buffer overflows or type confusion bugs. It's just the subset of developers that know how to write in the languages that allow you not to have those bug classes.
Right, because the language is not quote unquote safe. It's really up to the developer.
Yeah, and it's not even up to the developer, it's up to the organization. And if you are Microsoft and you say, okay, am I going to write this piece of code in Rust or C? Then you're probably going to do C because the subset of people that know Rust is probably 10.
Right.
And so you have the issue of it's almost like training a generation of developers to solve the problems we have today.
Right.
And so there will always be some catch-up that will need to happen. But I think Dino's point is the correct one, which is to a great extent, we don't necessarily care about bug classes. We care about the damages that a specific bug can cause. And to a great extent, a lot of mass exploitation hasn't happened as far as we know. Or at least...
beyond botnets.
Beyond botnets.
That are unkillable. Yeah.
Right. But I think I find really illustrative is to look at just what problems aren't problems in the mobile ecosystem, because that was a chance for us to start over.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so we took a lot of the lessons that we had. And so one of the big things we found is that our vendors are now responsible for their platforms, and especially for their platform security. So Apple provides a lot of security for their platform. Google provides a lot of security for the Android platform. It's for all Android devices that use Google Play services. And that has a lot of effects that make malware just not as much of a problem as it had been on desktops.
We're kind of moving that direction with software as a service too,
Right.
where you're not running the software, someone else is responsible. Like Google Mail is probably more secure than like a small medium business running Exchange. So we're moving in that direction with a lot of things that aren't necessarily the whole operating system, but at the application layer.
Right.
And I mean, the question there is, does that apply also to stuff like embedded devices? Because, I mean, so you can argue about this in two ways. One way is you need regulation to force that set of incentives. And the other way is to say, well, the vendors will want to have more secure software because otherwise they will lose customers, or because there's money to be made. Like one of the value proposition of your phone is that now you can make payments and so on and so forth, which you wouldn't be able to do if there wasn't this widespread belief that the phones are safer. And so it's a question of, okay, do you want to enforce that through regulation? Do you want to enforce a basic level of safety through regulation, or do you want to enforce that through economic incentives? And I don't think we have figured out that.
Yeah, and I don't think the economic incentives are aligned yet.
Yeah, not at the moment, at least.
And I fear for regulation, but I don't see any other tool.
Yeah.
Insurance I don't think is doing it.
No, I mean, insurance was really hard for like concentration of risk and what Chris was saying, right? So if everyone uses OpenSSL, then how are you going to insure hundreds
Well,
of
and would your
companies?
insurance company really come to you and say, you're 82% dependent on OpenSSL. We think you should diversify.
Yeah.
Go to LibreSSL. You're like, no, we're all running HP switches, and they only use, like you said, they're only bundling in a certain.
Yeah, so I think insurance is a really tough problem to solve in this space, given how things work.
Well, one of the big problems with insurance is they don't have the actuarial data to actually price things correctly. So it's just kind of a crapshoot.
What I've seen on insurance, they'll give you insurance coverage enough to pay for the breach notifications, right? The first, a couple weeks of Mandiant to come in and tell you how badly your house is on fire, and some PR money for messaging. And that's about it. So it's not even a lot of money.
But not the downstream effects of the community bank suing you to recover. Right. They had to issue all these new cards. That's where the big expenses
Right.
come
It's sort
in.
of like if you get insurance for replacement costs and your car burns down, you get an equivalent car. There's no replacement cost insurance.
And I mean, the other problem is that besides the actuarial data, even we don't know when we see a bug what's going to be the effect of that bug, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't have the expertise or the scientific or technical framework to be able to immediately look at a bug and say, okay, this is actually not going to be a problem.
Right. We still see treat a lot of the breaches as black swan events.
Right.
They're surprising because of this reason, surprising because of that reason.
And did you know that black swans are the norm in Australia? I just thought I'd bring that up.
That's a good point.
Right, because the English would always say black swan event, and then they travel to Australia and they're like, wait a minute, everything's a black swan. So there, it's a white swan event.
Exactly. A white swan event.
Example does not translate.
Right. So we're going to come to questions in the audience in a little bit. So if you're hearing anything that you want to ask or challenge, keep it in mind or raise your hand. Otherwise, we're just going to keep the conversation rolling. At one point, we are a little curious on the audience's view on certain problems. So we're curious what problems are specific maybe to the region as opposed to what problems are sort of technology focused. Because we assume we're all purchasing about the same services and products. But in Asia, a lot of the systems are newer. So your point about mobile systems, we're in the United States, we have a lot of legacy systems from when the technology was invented. And so we're stuck with these like anchors where maybe you had much more of a clean slate in some of the countries here, and that might have allowed you to have fewer of our legacy problems, but maybe it introduced newer problems that we're not so aware of. So I'm always fascinated to hear about those. So if you can think of an example like that, or something that you're particularly concerned about, raise your hand. We'd love to discuss it. Okay, so one of the other issues I had listed here was speed. And speed is fascinating because every company I talk to is obsessed with speed. Faster time to market, faster time to develop a product, faster than their competitors. We have to re-architect our IT system so we can become faster. And where is security in those discussions, right? You're in the boardroom, you're talking to your CEO, and all he is saying is speed, and all you're saying is slow down. or let us analyze it, or let's do a product review, or like, you're going to lose that fight as a security person. So I'm really curious. You need to speak the language of speed if you want to be taken seriously in a business context. And an example I like to use is for security is sort of you're the giant brakes on a Formula One race car, and you have giant brakes not to stop quickly. Ultimately, it allows the car to go faster. So how can you use security to enable the company to go faster? Maybe you have more confidence in your infrastructure, so therefore you can take more risks. You can enter new markets that maybe you wouldn't normally enter into because you're assured that maybe your secrets won't be stolen. So when you're thinking or talking about speed, how do you translate it to business?
So I think some of this relates back to what Dino was saying in the keynote. I think the problem we have today is that we are neither slow enough nor fast enough. In the sense
we're like
that
we're lukewarm.
We are in that aspirational phase where we want to win the race, but we're not
fully
there
committed.
yet.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the things Dino was saying the other day were about the ability to sort of like revert states really fast, or have like this diverse ecosystem that is diverse both because it doesn't look like the next one, but also because it changes really fast. And the problem is, like, if we can get to a point where those changes are really like sub-hour, then a lot of the security problems we know about today are probably not going to be there. The question is, can we get there? And if not, like, is speed, is the pace at which we're going today, in terms of like benefits that we get out of it, justifiable in terms of risks? And my answer at the moment is no. So either we go much faster.
So you think we need to go way faster or
way
slow down?
slower.
Because the current situation is not. Chris?
So I think that security that doesn't start to adopt the ways that development is changing and how IT operations is changing, if we keep doing things the same old way of a point-in-time pen test or something like that, you will be slowing the business down. But you look at, in order to go faster, development has changed, right? Like you don't have a QA team where you hand it over to the QA team and then they test for 2 weeks. The developers are writing unit tests for what they're doing, and it's part of a continuous integration, is to run the unit tests. So security has to start like how QA changed to fit into the way development needed to go fast, security needs to fit in there and do things continuously. Mm-hmm. Same thing with IT operations, and I think there's a big benefit to doing things the way now. It's like when you build a system, you're not sticking a CD in. You're turning up you're spinning up a VM, and you're automatically running a chef script or something like that to do the configuration to load stuff in, so that you can turn on a system by running a command, right? Well, the great thing about that is if security works that way, you can change the configuration of 1,000 systems by running a command if you need to change a configuration for a security reason or to patch them. So security has to start working the way that modern development and operations is working.
Yeah, and that's where the continuous integration pipeline really helps for security. Is like security, instead of being a gating function for a release, can be working continuously. Fuzzing continuously, finding new vulnerabilities, and just feeding those to the pipeline. And all those new vulnerabilities that are getting discovered by kind of security teams are in users' hands within 2 weeks or within a very rapid period of time.
Yeah, and also on that topic, I think security is particularly bad at using scale. Like fuzzing is one of the few examples where some companies are successfully using scale for the benefit of security. Because when you look at the lifetime of a new feature inside something like Chrome, then they don't slow down the development. They just say, well, we have this huge cluster of fuzzers, and we're going to add the features to the fuzzers while the people are adding the features to the browser, so that the time it takes to test properly is probably like a few days, and we can ship the feature on time.
And it works in parallel.
Yeah, and they work in parallel, but that only works if you use scale in the sense of both parallelizing the work, but also having essentially enough horsepower to do the testing.
So bug bounty programs are sort of a approach to scale because it is a distribution of security assessment, and you can use a bug bounty program as an early indicator of where you have more vulnerabilities. So imagine you have a team that is auditing or fuzzing, and then whenever there's a bounty vulnerability reported, you can say, all right, we need to apply more resources there, and then you use that as a leading indicator of where you need to make improvements.
I'm particularly pessimistic about bounties. Like I don't.
We're going to get to that.
Okay, I don't believe in the wisdom of the crowd, especially for specialized stuff. But
yeah. So that was sort of speed in development and testing, and then there's also the speed of incident response and detection.
Right.
And so if you think about as a security person, sort of what are your metrics? Or what can be measurable, because there's this fixation on measurement, at least in American businesses, right? If it can't be measured, it doesn't exist, is one mentality. And so when you think in security, what can you measure? Time from detection to time of remediation is a really indicative metric that a lot of companies use. So I've heard CIOs or CTOs bragging to each other like, oh, we're at 4 days from detection to remediation. Our goal is 1 day. Or, whatever. And they know what they need to do at each time, how much money, how much resources to get from 4 days to 3 days to 2 days. And that's a great metric for them. But and that might give them more confidence to go faster. They know we can move quicker because we know we have a 1 day response window. If they don't even know what their window is, then maybe they don't have the confidence to go faster. Can you guys think of any other metric though? I mean, what are your other security positive metrics you could use to be evaluated in this space? Where a salesperson knows what his number is. It's really obvious if we were all salespeople, but we're security people, and how can we be measured?
Well, we have that pretty easily for software security for an in-house development. You can look at the lifetime of a vulnerability. So from the time that it was created and committed to the source tree to the time that it was remediated, and your goal is to minimize that time span. Like vulnerabilities are created, but if they're fixed before you ship, that's great. If they're fixed quickly after you ship, but if it's been there for years, then something in the process isn't working.
Right, so that's maybe another indicator, sort of like incident response, but on the software.
For your own software incidents.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that in most cases is a semi-decidable problem. Like even with software, it's like, okay, you can see the ones that you fixed, but not the ones that you haven't.
Right.
And so
but it is a measurable.
It is a measurable number.
Maybe not an imprecise number, but it is a number. It's not like when the CEO says, well, you don't think we were attacked or breached last year and we spent $10 million on security. So does that mean next year I spend 5 or 20?
Yeah. But I mean, so the problem with something like software is, okay, you can, the problem is it's measurable, but I'm not confident that it should be used as a metric to decide budgets because, first of all, again, it's semi-decidable, and second, the reasons why certain things might or might have not happened are largely outside of the control of your organization, both for software. So the example for software is, this year we need to implement these very complicated features. And the example for a company could be, well, this year we're shipping this new product and there are credit card numbers in it. And so it's tricky to use that as a number.
Are there other things in software that people use for metrics maybe outside of security that we can learn from?
So, I was thinking about, your 4 day to 1 day example, but how do I know 1 day is even possible, right? So comparative benchmarking, I think, is an important thing where people can share, how are they performing? And you can share that across, maybe within, a trusted group like FSISAC or something in the U.S., where you can benchmark, or if you have a service provider that can anonymize the data, and then you can see how you're performing against your peers, and then you can say, well, maybe it does make sense to make investments because I know my peers are doing better. So if we don't share sort of benchmarking, you don't know what's possible, or you can't go to someone and say, what are you doing to do this 4 times faster than me?
Right.
Actually, so one thing that both you guys touched on is probably the better metric is not, how long does it take us to detect and then fix, is how long does it take us to get to that 1 day. And there are two. So one thing is now we have the technology to be able to deploy a new machine in probably 2 minutes. And what you were saying before is that one of the problems that the US has is legacy. And so the one of the big questions there is, okay, for all the legacy stuff, what is the investment that is needed to get to the point where I can have a chef script or like a Dockerized container that I can deploy in 5 minutes if there is a breach? Like, it doesn't matter whether there's the breach or not. It's just, can we get down to that one day in terms of IT? And the one thing I would say is that it's really sad that the fact that the tools we have to get there have nothing to do with security. Like, we haven't done anything to get to the point where we can go from 4 to 1 for the most part.
So good infrastructure actually helps security a lot. Like, basically, if you think about incident response, the tools, the things you want to go through are, I want to be able to detect an incident, then I want to be able to extract IOCs, and I want to know where those IOCs are across my entire environment. The better control you have over your infrastructure, the easier those later stages will be of knowing when those IOCs become active.
Now, so, has anybody had a question so far? If not, we're just going to keep rolling. A question? Okay, we have one question in the back, and then we'll just tell us your name or where you're from.
Yeah, hi, I'm Arvind. The question I have is, I really like what you said earlier about security needs to run like development and operations in a scientific way. And the ITIL framework really helped with that. Is there something like that which will help integrate security into operations? And what would that look like?
So I know in the SDLC, thinking about security testing as unit testing, right? So as opposed to the old way of manual pen testing was like the old way of doing QA. We had a bunch of people that were manually doing something, right? That people don't do QA anymore. They say when we build new functionality, we need to build an automation to test that functionality. If we build an API or an internal part of the program, we need to build some unit tests that actually exercise those internals, right? So I think security has to do the same thing, whether it's static analysis or dynamic analysis. It has to be able to deal with, those incremental pieces that are being built. As they're being built, and so it's just security is just lagging.
Is there
from
other things? Is there like a framework, or is there companies that are leading this area, or how would you? Let's say you intellectually you want to do this. Who do you turn to, or how do you know if you're doing a good job integrating security into sort of the Q&A unit test?
I think in general all the companies that do that, including my company, Veracode, are working towards it. The challenge is people who are doing security in the SDLC are always chasing the developers, right? This is like the challenge, right? If you're going to work the way the developers work, you're going to constantly be chasing what new languages are they doing, what new operating environments. Oh, they're using Docker now. Oh, and so it is a challenge to keep up with their speed. So that's a whole challenge within security, is to keep up with the speed of development and operations. And so I think we're lagging there.
So my Stroman argument against this method is the fact that because we've always been lagging behind, maybe really the idea is, okay, let's go talk to the people that write the programming languages and work with them to provide sort of like a number of safety guarantees. And it doesn't just work for memory corruption stuff. There's a lot of interesting work happening on information flow control, which would prevent a lot of bugs like SQL injection. Well, not like a lot of the leaks you would get out from non-memory corruption bugs would be fixed by something like that. It's a matter of where you apply the sort of like technology. Yeah. And what we're doing is that we're applying the technology farther up the chain, which means you have a ton of people you need to talk to and convince.
Right. You just want to get more closer.
You want to get to the root. And we've never done that in security.
Well, but new languages and new frameworks tend to at least try and solve the older problems. Like, you find SQL injection in programming environments that predate kind of that widespread knowledge of that as an issue. So newer frameworks tend to fix that, but they create new problems themselves. So, for instance, Node.js and their dependency problems they discovered new security problems. And that's what we're always discovering, the new security problems. And I don't believe that we should be saying no and halting innovation and halting progress, but that does require us understanding where kind of innovation wants to go and not going against that grain, going with it instead. Okay. And so my answer to what framework should we use is, well, what framework does your operations team use? And basically, for developers fixing, adding new features, they have their own development framework. How do we fit into that?
But on the subject of like frameworks, I go into companies and I find out that they're using 7 different logging frameworks across all the software they're writing, and they have like 5 different versions of each one of those, right? So if you look at some of the research that's been done around, the supply chain in manufacturing, it's like use less suppliers of higher quality, like really think about your suppliers. And I think we need to move that to software, that we start saying, okay, a developer just can't say, I want to use this logging framework, right? So there has to be some controls around
you get 3,
what diversity.
You don't get 10.
Yeah. Right, maybe you get 3, and then we always use the latest version of those 3 through a standardized supply chain, function within the software development process. So, I'm a big fan of like learning from what other industries have done well, and manufacturing has got supply chain down to make high quality products.
Okay, any more questions? We've got Jason Street in the front row.
Well, you mentioned about the detection rate and trying to lower the detection rate. Are you saying finding that companies are starting to get to the point where they're not trying to just build bigger defenses, but they're having to start understanding that they have to accept that a breach is going to occur and prepare for that kind of a breach to happen? Because we've been transitioning from just building walls to actually trying to.
I think so his question was, are we going from building big walls to accepting that breaches are going to happen, essentially? And I think really in my perspective, it's both now. They're still building big walls to lower give you a higher signal to noise ratio, but they know that somebody's going to get in, and so therefore it's about the detection.
We're also building more intelligent walls, in the sense that in the past it was, here are a bunch of tools that will prevent you from being breached ever. Now it's, here are a bunch of tools that do intelligence. Whether it works or not is a different problem, but there is the shift in mentality of, we want to understand what the breaches are all about, and now we can reduce that time.
So that goes back to Dino's point, which was I was going to ask us, is you had a slide that said that, from a tweet, that there are 2 enduring security technologies that seem to always be effective, 2-factor authentication and firewalls. And I wanted to get everybody's opinion on that, because 2-factors evolved and firewalls have evolved, but is it going to be sort of like these 2 controls, and why these 2 and not 3?
I think most of the security problems we have are by necessity, and it's a good thing, limited in time. Like, they're not going to exist forever. And so the argument that, we shouldn't have products that fix this specific type of issue because it's going to go away, it's not a good argument. Now, if you abstract away enough the sort of like solutions, right, then probably what you need are maybe not just 2, but are a very limited number of generic sort of like security techniques. Well, but my point is that there is a place for both type of solutions.
But it's interesting. It's not intrusion detection and honeypots, right, and threat intelligence, and it's like firewalls and 2-factor. So is it because we haven't learned to use the new tools, or they're just not getting us the returns? The early promises don't live up to the...
We don't have a way to measure the new tools very well. Like, the problem is, is your IDS working out great, or so and so? Like, we understand 2-factor pretty well. Like, the video that Duo has, it's pretty easy to understand thing, right? Maybe your IDS is actually saving the day a lot more than your 2FA token, but you just don't know. Like, we don't have metrics. And so, like, I wouldn't, again, it's a Twitter argument. Yeah. Like, the way I look at it is, it's stuff people say on Twitter. But
I did want to come back to Jason's question, though. So in the incident response world, they call it assume breach. And that is kind of the mindset that you will be breached and have a preparation. The way I look at that is just, for a long time, we just had no plan B. We just built defenses, and then, what if a defense failed? I don't know. Let's make sure that doesn't happen.
Let's double down on fences.
Yeah, double down on fences. And so, we still need to do plan A, but also having a plan B of, when something happens, we need to know how to deal with it and how to respond and how to go through all this. And I think even for software security designs, you should take that same assume breach mindset of, well, what if this security boundary is bypassed? How do we detect if we have our preventions, but let's also set up some leading detections so we know when that's breached and something happens. Maybe we're notified, maybe something else happens, and you bake that into your software architecture. And I think that's where software security can learn something from the incident response community.
Yeah, I agree. I think the application layer is completely missing the idea of detection and response.
Right.
Right. Like what apps do you have that do good logging? Right. And web servers do it for they log, but most other applications don't log. So like if my app returns like 1,000 rows of data and it never ever returns more than 10 by design, like why isn't that logged?
Right. Why don't we have telemetry and anomaly detection on that telemetry that basically says something is weird here and I'm going to fall down, or I'm going to safely stand down in some way.
Right. So we have no visibility into a lot of attacks at the application layer. Like we find out because Brian Krebs saw the credit card data being sold. That's how we find out that the database is
like,
breached.
no, that process is running a little hot. Okay, well, what's it doing?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, unless you K-trace it and then spend the rest of your life trying to figure it out. So then that leads me to
Jeff, question.
Sir.
If this works, I could take over the whole session in a brief second with a bajillion questions, and
But you only get one.
I only get one, and so the detection to response piece, I think, is an interesting one, right? We all know that the time to detect is still well over 200 days, right? And I think it is something that's related to the amount of data that we have and what our applications are doing, but response is still a pie in the sky for most of us as an organization. We're not detecting fast enough to respond. So how do we even improve some of those mechanisms in what we're doing in our programs, right? And so I'd love to understand some of those aspects, and we could do others as well. But
So one of my first observation on that is I think people are running to third-party service providers and running to the cloud. So small to medium businesses don't have the skills, they don't have the talent, so they're going to outsource, right? The Google Mail, and so now you're up to, well, what's the incident response time of Google, right? Well, you don't know that as a consumer. You just assume it's good. And so as you start outsourcing, you lose more and more visibility. Like one of the companies I used to work at, we outsourced our email to an email provider. And so when I got on board, I started asking them questions. Have you ever noticed that you're under attack? No. Have you ever told a company you've noticed that their mail instance is under attack? No. Would you notice us if you did notice an attack? Who do we call in the middle of the night if we think we're under attack? A lot of these third-party service providers are not sophisticated, right? They just have experience in running thousands of instances of Outlook or something. So I'm wondering, how effective is this? To your point, right? People aren't good at it, so they're looking for a dodge. They're going to, risk avoidance. They're going to go to the cloud. They're going to make it somebody else's problem. But is that the smart move?
I think it's like supply chain management, right? It's like you have to ask questions. You can't assume that the software you're buying was developed securely. You can't assume that service provider has the right processes and procedures and infrastructure to be secure. I mean, when you hire a person, you go through a lengthy interview process trying to suss out, is this person capable of doing the job? But we'll just sign up to a service because the company's making money and I've heard the brand name before. So yeah. So you have to ask questions. And even better, you should be able to go to an expert third party that assesses, SaaS companies, say, and say, what does this third party say about this SaaS company? So I think we have to get into that supply chain management, both with software and services we're procuring. Because, I mean, obviously we're going to start doing more and more services, and we can't just keep, degrading our security by, not having visibility.
And also changing the model for how we, use our email, as this example, will give us different security threats. So if I run my own mail server, I have to worry about someone attacking the mail server directly. If I outsource to Google Apps, I don't have to worry about that, and they don't really have to either. But I do need to worry about someone archiving all my mail that's not me. And if we ask the right questions of like making sure that they have these features to detect like maybe like a circuit breaker, to detect egress of information above a certain rate. And eventually those features will be developed.
I mean, I agree with both. There's just one thing I would add is that probably like the better solution is maybe not to detect, but to restore periodically. Again, this goes back to something that Dino was saying, which is we're pretty good at knowing what it's sort of good at knowing what's a known good. And so maybe in the greater scheme of things, in most cases, what you want to do is revert back fast enough to a known good so that it doesn't matter whether that specific machine was breached. Now, clearly, it would be a nice to have to be able to say, well, we are reverting also because we were breached.
Right.
But I think it's a much easier problem to figure out how do we revert back to a known good state while preserving the data versus how can we detect all the potential attacks that could happen on my network.
But you have to build your infrastructure pipeline to be able to do that. Like you
But
can't.
that's where the cloud helps.
Yeah.
Because now
It's all automated and it's
And,
It forces you to learn those.
Right.
Yeah, and also you can go to your provider and say, hey, so what do you do
How do
for
I
that?
snapshot?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And we already know how to do that intrinsically because of the way we play video games, right? Every time we die, we just revert and we keep playing.
Right.
It's intuitive, right?
Right, it's very intuitive. Okay, let's have time for another question, and then we're going to start to wind down the session. I know you've got a question in the audience, sir.
Wondering about data exfiltration and how this relates to what you guys were just talking about how, security is putting a lot of emphasis on external threats, but if we look at things like Snowden and various other leaks that have occurred recently, it seems like internal threats are something that is a little bit overlooked, I think, and I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on that.
I think better access control is the thing that needs to be done. In many ways, access control is done badly, both because the technology is not there, and also because
it's cumbersome and it slows you down.
Right. So, and what's crazy is that we do have ways to take rules and say, okay, here's a set of rules. Please come up with a way to apply them. Like we know how to use solvers and so on and so forth. It's just none of the technology we have today is capable of doing any of that.
Well, so just by a show of hands, how many people in the audience basically deploy Windows in their environment? Microsoft Windows. 20 people. So everybody else is running OS X. So how many people how many people deploy them and all your users in your enterprise are running as user, not as administrator? Right? Less than half of the people that raised their hands. And so the technology exists already and people don't use it. Least privilege, we just don't take advantage of.
Yeah, and I mean also like another thing, again, going back to what Dino said the other day is that, so if you take the Snowden case, like the Snowden example, we should be at a point where I don't have to give somebody my password. I can give them a one-time token. So maybe Snowden could have logged in, take like 2 gigabytes of data instead of however many, and then it would have not been able to log in again in the future.
Yeah.
And one you mentioned least privilege. I think is an important thing to underscore that also carries to least privilege of what you can access on the network. And what's interesting to me is that we always treat defense against intrusions and insider threats as separate things. I think always thought of them as the same thing.
Yeah.
And so if someone decides to do something malicious, or there's someone with their credentials doing something malicious, there should be no difference in how you defend against either of them. And I think we can I always like looking for examples in the physical world. Like, for instance, I forgot my key. So I went to the hotel. They said, okay, here's your key card that'll work for 1 hour. And we can, we should be able to issue tokens like that on our network that you can access data for 1 hour after, doing a TwoFactor or doing something else. Or when you need additional access to something, we just build these mechanisms so we don't have access to everything at all times. And that's how we build our networks today.
And so, also the concept of two-person control, right? I don't think that's really taken advantage of.
No, and I mean also like the stuff we were talking about beyond Corp is also function. Like the reason, I think one of the reasons why we consider threats, like external and internal threats, are as two separate things, is a byproduct of how we build our networks. If we do stuff like Beyond Corp, which essentially is your corporate network doesn't exist, it's the internet, and then you rely on the security of the endpoint, then it doesn't really change if the data being exfiltrated is because I stole Dino's device or
right. It's just it's a flatter way of thinking. Beyond Corp, or originally it was what the Jericho forum. The idea was that just protect the endpoints, and then it really doesn't matter if you have a firewall or not. And then that allows you to move faster because you don't have to build up this whole infrastructure if you want to open a new office. You just
and you don't have that pretense of trust that now we do have with but that's the internet and this is our internal
this is
trusted
the trusted
network.
section. Yeah. Okay, so that's it. We're going to be around for a little bit. We're happy to talk to you afterward, and we really want to thank you for coming to Black Hat Singapore, making it a success this year. Next year we'll be back. We'll be back one floor above us, not on this floor, and we're looking to grow. And so, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you again next year.